Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing the autobiography by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, through his autobiography, talks about how he has been influenced by both his grandfathers. In his autobiography, he states that his family members have also contributed immensely in his growth and development. Charles Darwin was born in a post-revolutionary age. The process of the post-revolution had begun in America in 1775, developed into the War of Independence of 1776, and crossed the Atlantic to inflame France in 1789. While Europe and America were engaged in violent reaction to the establishment, in Britain a more subtle revolution developed which would, in the long run, exert much influence over the future of the world. This has since come to be known as the Industrial Revolution. Charles Darwin's grandfathers fitted precisely into the mold of the Industrial Revolutionary. His paternal grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a well-known doctor who had a country practice in Shrewsbury, just north of Birmingham. He was an intellectual who was gifted equally in the fields of literature and science. Darwin's maternal grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, the man single-handedly and starting with almost nothing, created the world-famous pottery business which until today bears his name. The two men were close friends and active members of a group who called themselves the Lunar Society. This society was a collection of wealthy men interested in machines and mechanical devices. They met monthly at the time of the full moon. Both the grandfathers were political freethinkers. In the present world, they would perhaps be referred to as social democrats. They were also greatly influenced by Unitarianism. This is an unconventional form of Christianity which teaches that God has a single aspect. This is a doctrine which tries to eradicate the stifling dogma of legalistic Christian thinking. Such unorthodox social and religious views exerted a major influence on the two families for at least 3 generations. These also lay at the root of much of Charles Darwin's own attitudes to life. Darwin had graduated from Cambridge and was now well and truly on the road to joining clergy. He walked away from the notice board announcing the results. He would never come closer to the church than he then was. The British naturalist Charles Darwin's The Autobiography was published in 1887, 5 years after his death. Darwin wrote the book which he titled Recollections of the Development of My Mind and Character for his family. He states that he started writing it around May 28, 1876 and had finished it by August 3rd of the same year. Francis Darwin edited the book and removed several passages about Darwin's critical view of God and Christianity. The book was then published in London by John Murray as part of the Life and Letters of Charles Darwin. This print also included an autobiographical chapter. The omitted passages were later restored by Darwin's granddaughter Nora Barlow in a 1958 edition to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. This edition was published in London by Collins under the title The Autobiography of Charles Darwin. This was edited, had an appendix and notes by his granddaughter Nora Barlow. In his autobiography, Darwin describes how at Edinburgh in 1826 he was introduced to Lamarckian evolution by Dr. Robert Grant. I listened in silent astonishment and, as far as I can judge, without any effect on my mind. I had previously read the Zoonomia of my grandfather, in which similar views are maintained, but without producing any effect on me. Nevertheless, it is probable that hearing rather early in life such views maintained and praised may have favored my upholding them under a different form in my Origin of Species. At this time, I greatly admired the Zoonomia, but on reading it a second time after an interval of 10 or 15 years, I was much disappointed, the proportion of speculation being so large to the facts given. To Darwin the empiricist, his grandfather's work might indeed have few facts to offer, but it was most definitely a source of inspiration as far as ideas were concerned. Normally, a historian of science is likely to give prominence to contributions by his own ancestors with pride, but in Darwin's famous historical sketch, Erasmus was relegated to a derogatory sentence in a footnote. This incomprehensible behavior has been explained in the following way. Despite his strong affinity with his grandfather, Charles was forced to disown him because reviews of The Origin of Species accused him of merely reviving the idea of his grandsire, so Charles had to emphasize his independence. Darwin was a great thinker, but had very little self-confidence. He said in his autobiography, "Whenever I have found out that I have blundered or that my work has been imperfect, and when I have been contemptuously criticized, it has been my greatest comfort to say hundreds of times to myself, I have worked as hard as I could and no man can do more than this." Darwin was raised as a Christian, trained as a cleric, and died an atheist. Yet, his theory of evolution does not dispute Christianity at its deepest level. Although it certainly destroyed fundamentalist principles and naive creation myths, evolution is not an atheist doctrine as some would like to imagine. Darwin was a very humble man, totally dedicated to his studies, a scientist who worked meticulously and in solitude. What is striking is that by Darwin's own account, he can remember almost nothing of his mother and in particular the events surrounding her death. In his autobiography, he mentioned her only briefly. "My mother died in July 1817 when I was a little over 8 years old, and it is odd that I can remember hardly anything about her except her deathbed, her black velvet gown, and her curiously constructed work table." He then goes on to describe his school life and childhood pranks. A short time before his mother died, in the spring of 1817, Charles had become a day boy at a small school in Shrewsbury, which was run by a Unitarian minister, Reverend Case, whose church Susanna had regularly attended for many years. The Darwin children had been baptized here as well. Charles Darwin stayed there for little more than a year before being sent as a boarder to Shrewsbury School. This was a small but growing public school which later established itself as one of the most prestigious schools in Britain. Charles detested regimented learning and had absolutely no interest in the classics, which, unfortunately for him, constituted the majority of the curriculum. He regularly cribbed off friends and did the absolute minimum to avoid a beating for laziness or poor test results. As Darwin put it, nothing could have been worse for the development of my mind than Dr. Butler's school, as it was strictly classical, nothing else being taught except a little ancient geography and history. The school as a means of education to me was simply blank. About the time he began at Shrewsbury, Charles took to going on long solitary walks in the nearby countryside. During these treks, he would go into deep reverie, thinking about all manner of things and often forgetting where he was. On one occasion, he was so deep in thought that he fell into a ditch. It has been suggested that these solitary walks were another symptom of the heartache he felt over the loss of his mother, and that it acted as a form of subconscious therapy. The Darwins were, for the most part, happy in Upper Gower Street. Charles continued to yearn for the countryside, continued to agonize over the social and religious implications of his work on evolution, and maintained his struggle against recurring illness. Despite the fact that he suffered some of his worst bouts of sickness, migraine and skin irritations during this period, within 4 years he fathered their first 3 children, wrote coral reefs, edited most of zoology and filled notebook after notebook with his unpublished private researches. In his autobiography, he declares, "Whilst we resided in London, I did less scientific work, though I worked as hard as I possibly could, than during any other equal length of time in my life." This was Darwin's coming of age as a biologist. He later described his career as a biologist as having 3 stages: the mere collector in Cambridge, the collector and observer in the Beagle and for some years after, and the trained naturalist after and only after the Cirripede work. In his autobiography, Darwin wrote that the Cirripedes form a highly varying and difficult group of species to class, and my work was of considerable benefit to me when I had to discuss in the origin of species the principles of a natural classification. After some successful string pulling, Hooker and Lyell managed to book the recently revitalized Linnean Society, new and operating from its new premises in Piccadilly. For this, Darwin writes in his autobiography, "The circumstances under which I consented to the request of Lyell and Hooker to allow of an abstract from my manuscript, together with a letter to Asa Gray dated 5th September 1857 to be published at the same time with Wallace's essay, are given in the Journal of the Proceedings of the Linnean Society, 1855, page 45. I was at first very unwilling to consent, as I thought Mr. Wallace might consider my doing so unjustifiable, for I did not know how generous and noble was his disposition. The extract from my manuscript and the letter to Asa Gray had neither been intended for publication and were both badly written. Mr. Wallace's essay, on the other hand, was admirably expressed and quite clear. Darwin had begun thinking about the species problem long before the end of his voyage on the Beagle. In his autobiography, he describes how during the voyage he had been deeply impressed by the manner in which closely allied animals replace one another in proceeding southwards over the continent, and by the South American character of most of the productions of the Galapagos archipelago, and more especially by the manner in which they differ slightly on each island of the group. What Darwin had noticed in modern terms is that many of the species on the Galapagos, birds for example, had evolved from a common ancestral stock and adapted to conditions on each island. In one place, the birds might have long beaks for probing into crevices, while on another island, the close relations of those birds descended from the same ancestors had evolved heavy beaks for crushing tough seeds. Darwin wrote in his autobiography, such factors as these could be explained on the supposition that species gradually became modified. According to Darwin's autobiography, it was in June 1842 first allowed myself the satisfaction of writing a very brief abstract of my theory in pencil in 35 pages. This outline survives among Darwin's papers and is indeed dated May and June 1842. But there is also a 13-page outline written in ink and undated, which Darwin does not mention in his autobiography. Several historians persuasively argue that this dates back to 1839, shortly after Darwin became familiar with Malthus's ideas. The pencil sketch is thought more complete and shows that Darwin's ideas about evolution were essentially in place by the time he moved from London to Downhouse. He was eager for more specimens because, with the barnacles out of the way, Darwin's thoughts were concentrating once again on the species question. From September 1854 onwards, he wrote in his autobiography, I devoted all my time to arranging my huge piles of notes, to observing and experimenting in relation to the transmutation of species. But why should species transmute, diverge from a common stock? By now, Darwin thought he had the solution. He tells us that the moment the idea struck him remained clear in his mind, so that I can remember the very spot in the road